Once again, I'd like to focus on the other side of the transaction, and now I'm going to be focusing on the lessor's accounting for a lease classified as a finance lease in accordance with IFRS 16, AASB 16. To keep things simple, I'm going to focus on the lease of an aircraft, the same essential transaction as before, but rather than focusing on it from the airline's perspective, now I'm going to focus on it from the bank, the lessor perspective, de Havilland Bank. The term of the lease is once again 5 years. The fair value of the aircraft at inception is $100 million. The lease payments are $16.1 million annually in arrears, and at the end of the lease period, lease term, there is a residual payment of $50 million. Once again, we have to work out the implicit interest rate in the lease, and it's exactly the same as it was for the lessee. And you can see we have the fair value of the aircraft, we have the cash flows, we work out the net present value, and it's still 7.5%. We also have to allocate the lease receipts between a principal and interest revenue components, and the table is calculated in exactly the same way. And once again, I do come to in the bottom right hand corner to the termination. Separating periodic payments from termination entries, I think, just keeps things much simpler. What about initial recognition? Well, what we need to appreciate is that because this is a finance lease, the bank has no continuing interest in the asset, which is subject to the lease, and so what we need to recognise at inception is the departure of the plane from the financial statements of the lessor, and in its place they recognise a lease receivable. Okay, the bank mightn't have owned the plane, but maybe they made the payment to the plane manufacturer, but it has the same effect. So I've used plane here to emphasize the point that the lessor has no continuing interest in the plane. It doesn't have to depreciate it. It doesn't have to do it subject to impairment. It doesn't have a plane. It only has a lease receivable. What about subsequent to that initial recognition? Well, in year one, they'd recognize cash being received of $16.1 million. And they'd have to allocate that between interest and principal. Interest revenue of $7.5 million, and the balances being a reduction in the lease receivable balance. And you go through the same process in years 2, 3, 4, and 5. And once again, these are just coming straight out of the table. At the end of the lease, the lessee would make a payment to the lessor of $50 million, and that would completely extinguish the lease receivable, and that represents the end of the lease. Please note that all we're accounting for is a finance receivable, a lease receivable, and because the majority of the risks and benefits have been transferred to the lessor, there is no residual interest in the asset, there's no depreciation, there's no impairment in the accounts of the lessor.